Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Unity Mobile Insights Report 2022 webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got a lot of cool information to go over. So today, we're going to be going over some highlights from our most recent Insights report. So this 30+ page report covers many aspects about the business of mobile gaming and features answers to many questions our mobile game dev partners have been asking us for quite a while. The report is available for free download, and we'll be recording this webinar and uploading it after. Therefore, don't feel like you need to take notes. All the material is going to be available for you online for free. And we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. If you have any questions, please submit them using the Q&A feature. They might get lost in the chat, so please use the Q&A feature instead. We'll try to answer as many as we can. Anyways, so let's do some introductions. My name is Emery, and I lead the Publisher Operations team here at Unity. With me today is Kristen, a member of the Publisher Operations Insights team. So who are the Pub Ops team? Well, Publisher Operations is a group of experienced live game analysts, product managers, and more. We've all developed or operated games big and small in the past, so we've all been in the shoes of our game development partners before. We work with everybody from some of the smallest indie game dev teams to the biggest AAA developers in the world. And we're Unity agnostic and work with customers making a game on any engine, including Unreal, but don't tell our boss that, and using any service. As I mentioned earlier, one member of the team is Kristen C, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kristen, and I'm on our Publisher Operations Insights team. Super happy to see that everyone is rolling in the chat room, coming from all over the world. Again, welcome. Before joining Unity, I was actually an analyst at a game developer company. I help casual and also mid-core games to smoothly integrate ad monetization strategy specifically into their core game experiences using a data-driven approach.
Cool. And as for myself, I've worked on both the studio and publishing side, and I've worked on games like The Sims and Call of Duty. I've also worked on some games that you've probably never heard of before, but those small indie games and projects taught me just as much as working on the AAA ones. Alrighty, with intros out of the way, let's talk about the Unity Mobile Insights report. So this report takes in data from over 168 million game players, 28 billion mobile game ads, and 46 million monthly in-app purchases for a really comprehensive view of mobile monetization from the last year. We aggregate and anonymize all the data from our developers and players to make sure that when we do our analysis, we're doing it in a privacy-first way. The full report is available for free download at the URL shown here. At Unity, we believe the world is a better place with more creators, and insights like these help democratize information for developers who wouldn't normally have access to this kind of knowledge. So let's dive into some key areas of this report. First, I'll talk about some interesting game genre data and the importance of identifying a target audience when making a title. Next, Kristen will walk you through some very interesting soft launch and user acquisition findings. We'll both wrap back up by talking about the balance between in-app advertising and in-app purchases. After that, we'll address any questions that come in during the Q&A, so make sure to use that Q&A feature so we can see them. Otherwise, in chat, we'll probably miss them because I feel like there's a lot of people talking right now. All right, so the first takeaway is that you should plan early to improve the chances of your game success. It's a little obvious, but early planning for any venture, games included, leads to success. For games in particular, developers often come at this planning from two different angles. Sometimes games are built around a compelling gameplay idea or core loop, and then the rest of the game organically forms around it. In these cases, developers already have the plan of what they want to do and really just need to focus on tuning the overall progression or metagame structures within their title. But other times, there's a business-focused approach to making sure that a game studio or developer's next project will be financially viable. In these cases, it's a good idea to take a look at the current market and what players are playing the most of. So we took a look at the genres of games being played in 2021 and then further broke them down into more granular subgenres. When I say genre of game, I'm using the publicly available categories that the iOS and Google Play stores use. Subgenres are actually a lot more specific and get into the actual kind of gameplay that's actually in that game. So, for example, instead of just looking at the action games as a single genre, we broke that down into categories like platformers, shooters, and sandbox action games. From there, we totaled up the entire daily active user population of players playing that overall game genre. and then calculated what percentage of a genre's daily active user base that specific subgenre contained. So while there's a lot of cool information that can be gleaned from this table over here, I'm just going to go into a few cool insights. Once again, this report is available online if you want to sit down and really digest things. So within the action genre, we found that platformers were the most popular kind of subgenre, with almost 30% of action game players playing platformer games. This is a classic genre that's been around since the earliest gaming consoles, and it seems that there's still no shortage of players for platformer games. Next, we looked at word games. So we segmented games here into classic word games, as well as trivia-based word games and other word-based puzzle games. Classic word games include titles like crossword puzzles, Scrabble-style games, and basically find a word kind of games. Pretty much any title where you're trying to construct or extract a word from a group of letters fell into this classic category. Unsurprisingly, this genre had the least amount of diversity, with 98% of word game players playing the classic variety of word games. That's not to say that there isn't a ton of diversity in games here, but the players in general who are playing word games are really gravitating towards that tried and true kind of experience. It's also worth noting that many word games could be seen as a subset of puzzle games already, but because the iOS and Google Play Stores have already taken a step of breaking them out, a lot of the homogenization lies in one genre, which is the classic word game. So one last genre we looked into were hyper-casual games. Hyper-casual games are fairly well known within mobile gaming, but for those of you unfamiliar with them, imagine the days of simple browser-based Flash games. I'm kind of dating myself with that, but imagine the early 2000s. These games had core gameplay loops that were immediately obvious to players. Things like throwing darts to pop balloons or racing a car down a track until it crashed for a high score, just a really simple, immediately obvious experience. Hyper-casual games focus primarily on acquiring users cheaply and then are entirely okay with those users basically churning out after they've had their week or a couple of days worth of fun. They have very little in terms of longer metagame or progression. Similar to action games, the top hyper-casual subgenre was platformer games, followed closely by puzzle and action-based hyper-casual games. Within hyper-casual overall, we saw a fairly diverse representation among subgenres, suggesting that hyper-casual's wide reach also allowed for a wide range of play experiences. Overall, a little bit of market research can really go a long way into planning your next title. In particular, planning a soft launch is one of the most important parts of mobile game development, aside from making the game itself. So I'm going to hand it over to Kristen to talk about the best ways to soft launch your title and test your user acquisition strategies for that new game.
Thank you, Emery. So before diving into our soft launch data trends, I think it's very important for game developers to understand the significance of a soft launch. The reason why soft launch duration and locations are very often super thoughtful decisions is because it is a golden opportunity for early detection of crash, bugs, choke points in user interfaces. It is also a really good time to get feedback on core loop design, level tuning, how the game's actual performance track towards its monetization goals, as well as the effectiveness of different features in converting your users into payers. Besides, you can also identify the characteristics of your game's high engagement cohort, which will be your golden cohort, plus general player behaviors. It also helps developers to really understand the user acquisition and also marketing strategies they should lean into to acquire exactly the players with high return on investment. Ultimately, games would like to achieve a higher average player lifetime value than the cost of average install, and you would definitely want to catch any early signs before a global launch. Even for indie developers, if having your game being bought by a bigger publisher is your goal, soft launch is also a crucial window because that's exactly when you want to get on bigger publishers' radar if you wish to. So in this chart specifically, we looked at the soft launch locations for games that were launched in the past 3 years. Darker areas on the map indicates countries that are more popular for soft launch. The top countries for soft launch were Canada, Australia, Indonesia, New Zealand, and England. All of these countries actually preceded United States. The reason why these countries are picked is because they have a similar culture to the game's target market for actual launch. User acquisition cost is also relatively cheaper. And also majority of the players in these countries are English speakers. Another reason is that ad monetization performance does vary very widely across countries and also user cohort. So during a soft launch, developers definitely would want to test their ad monetization tool in countries that have similar demand mix and also functioning ad networks coverage as the countries that they plan for the actual formal launch. In terms of when to soft launch, we found that the most popular month was January, followed by the summertime, which would be July and also August. Over 10% of games have started their soft launch in one of these months. The reason behind it is user acquisition is usually cheaper in the beginning of the year when you're off from the holiday season, like Thanksgiving, Black Friday, and also Christmas. Also during summer, kids and also young adults are enjoying their break from school, and soft launching in this specific window actually helps developers to capture more data points from these target audiences during the gaming peak period. In order to collect sufficient indicators for whether a game is going to sink or swim, so as you can imagine, soft launch period should take at least a couple of weeks. In our analysis, end of soft launch was detected by the game's official release date on Google Play Store or Apple App Store. It ranges anywhere from 3 weeks to roughly 10 weeks across genres. On average, it takes 6.5 weeks to complete a soft launch. For games that have a simpler core loop, shorter player lifespan, and follow a common playbook for monetization, like what Emery has mentioned earlier, such as hyper-casual, card game, and also casino game, usually it takes around 3 to 5 weeks. While as for games in the mid-core or hardcore domains, like sports game, action, RPG, strategy games, users usually take a longer time to progress across levels and start spending. So your soft launch period will also have to lengthen into around 8 weeks to be a bit more comprehensive. Another benchmark number that a lot of developers are interested in is, so how long does it take for games to reach their peak daily active users after they formally launch their game? The length of this period actually depends on how much your ad spending budget is, what media channels or strategies are being leveraged to advertise your new games, and of course, how tuned in are the gamers in your specific genre to new games that are being released into the market. On average, we found that it takes around 7 weeks for games to reach this peak daily active users. Gamers in the mid-core and hardcore genres like simulation, racing, strategy, and also action games typically react to new games released to the market a little bit more quickly. So these games reach their peak daily active users in a relatively shorter period of time. And for hyper-casual games, they also reach their peak daily active users relatively fast, but for a different reason. It's actually because users usually start churning pretty quickly, and it's expected when the game loses novelty and other new games are released in the market. Users usually move on to the new games in the same genre. Casual games like board games, puzzle games attract a wider variety of users. Hence, it takes slightly longer period for these games to ramp up to their peak active users. It takes roughly around 11 weeks. Games advertising spending, like any other game development cost, as you imagine, is a pool of very limited resources. And the key problem that you would definitely want to solve here is how to get more bang for your buck. To evaluate the effectiveness of user acquisition campaigns, we usually look at things like how many of your ad viewers have clicked, that's click-through rate, what proportion of ad impression and clicks have actually translated into installs for your game. So that's install rate and also conversion rate. And of users that installed from seeing your ad are they actually staying in your game, or do they churn away relatively quickly? In this session, we would like to cover the pro tips for spending user acquisition budget wisely. In our insight report, we created these table views that look at the genre which developers advertise their games in correlation to user acquisition KPIs that we just outlined. We picked one example each from hyper-casual, casual, mid-core, and hardcore categories each to illustrate the trends. Regardless of your game's genre, Advertising your game to audiences who are playing hyper-casual games drive the highest click-through rate. This is probably because hyper-casual game players are more laid back when they're playing the games, and hyper-casual games have both opt-in and non-opt-in ad formats. Hyper-casual gamers hence don't just rush through the ad in order to claim the in-game reward and progress to the next level. Also, not quite surprising, advertising in your game in the same genre drive relatively higher ad install rate and also conversion rate. This is probably because, as you can imagine, you're already advertising your game to the users that like games similar to your own. And more importantly, we found that cannibalization does not seem to be a significant concern for this type of targeting. Even when users do download the new games after seeing an ad, they don't turn away from the original game completely in a lot of cases. On the other hand, we find that there are a few cross-genre trends that are quite beyond expectation. For example, advertising a hyper-casual game in word and casino games appear to bring installs with decent retention, meaning that the player base actually does overlap. Card and word game players who saw an ad from puzzle game and installed also have strong tendency to remain in the game even after 7 days. Much to our surprise, card and casino game players who installed their simulation and strategy games from seeing an ad also tend to have good retention. And a good proportion of racing gamers converted on simulation game ads, while action gamers also converted on strategy game ads. This gives game developers an interesting segment to work with in terms of user retention. Games from different genres typically don't block each other's ads because they're not considered as direct competition. Meanwhile, you still have a chance to get good quality installs from these genres. Of course, in this presentation today, we are only scratching the surface of where you should spend your user acquisition budget. If your specific genre is not being mentioned here, do check out our full monetization and insight report. The genre will be covered there. Even after game developers find the most promising genre to spend their advertising budget on, you would still need to thoughtfully incorporate different elements of ad creative designs in order to grab your target audience's attention. While some would think that the design of ad creative should be an intuitive process, we actually took a data-driven approach to draw insights from the elements that are commonly seen in ads with the highest click-through rate in our ad network. From our analysis, we found that showing core gameplay that matched with what is being offered in the actual game, especially using the format of a playable ad, is the most engaging method of all. And it is widely adopted by 86% of advertising games across all genres. It is associated with higher click-through rate as well as conversion rate because users don't feel that the advertisement is sort of like a bait and switch. If you are advertising for a mid-core or hardcore game, it is even better if you show things like power-up, upgrades along with your core gameplay to engage your target audience. Loud music is commonly used across performance ad creatives in hyper-casual, casual, mid-core, and hardcore genres, and is actually associated with slightly higher conversion rate as well. Contrary, ads that feature a story plot often have a vague call to action and hence is not so compelling for the users and is not that widely adopted. On the other hand, while on-screen text is a common method of showing game instructions compared to voice-over walkthrough, we actually found that audio works better in terms of driving click-through rate, especially in the casual genre. This is probably because it allows more of the captivating features of a game to be shown on screen instead of showing text, while reducing the demand on users' cognitive load. While showing successful progression or a lot of rewards is more popular among performance ads in action, adventure, board, casino, and sports genres, showing game failure, on the other hand, is a more common strategy in puzzle and also simulation categories. Our further analysis actually showed that bad gameplay outcome is associated with 60% higher click-through rate and 50% higher conversion rate compared to ad creatives that don't leverage these methods. It is because bad gameplay likely trigger users takeover mentality, making them think that, you know what, if I download the game, I'm probably going to perform better than this. Another call out is that even though a lot of casino games recently like to advertise their games with real money incentives, users are typically quite bothered by ads that look like a scam. Hence, they are associated with 60% lower click-through rate and 24% lower conversion rate. Advertisements that feature dramatic real-person reaction to the game are typically also not too welcomed because they could appear to be very disruptive for users, especially when players are in the middle of a game, and hence these ads don't typically drive good install rate. With that, I'm going to pass mic back to Emery to talk about the balance that a lot of games are trying to strike between two key monetization pillars.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. So every mobile developer knows that in-app purchases are key to monetization. With nearly every mobile title being free to play these days, developers need to have microtransactions in their game to actually earn revenue. But in-app advertising is just as important as in-app purchases for overall app monetization, especially if your game falls into certain genres where players are much less likely to purchase something. Let's take a look at the numbers. Overall, on average, less than 1.8% of daily active players will actually make a purchase. This is, of course, a really low number. We'd all love it to be higher. And it actually drops significantly for genres that feature more in-app advertising, such as word games and hyper-casual titles. But bear in mind that these are average numbers and are therefore skewed to the right because many of the smaller games have very low number of paying users. The games that rank more highly in the App Store charts can have payer conversion rates that are a good deal higher, but even in our experience and looking at our data, even the stronger titles, the conversion rate rarely exceeds 5%. The chart here therefore shows relevant trends. While individual games might be higher or lower than the averages we see here, overall we see games like casual and puzzle titles with the strongest percentage of daily active payers. Let's dive a little more into these paying users. So we broke down the players who make purchases into games into two categories: high value payers and relatively lower value paying users. The high value payers represent payers in the 95th percentile of spend and above when ranked against all other paying users. The lower value payers are all other paying users who don't fall into this high paying user group. Within gaming, these are colloquially referred to as whales and minnows. On average, we can see here that the high value payers make many times more purchases within a calendar year than when compared to the low value payers. These high value payers purchase on average 50 to 65 times per year, depending on the platform, while everybody else only purchases 3 to 4 times. There's often a saying that whales in a game make a majority of the game's revenue, and we do see that to be pretty true here. Those high value pairs can make up to over 70% of a game's annual IAP revenues. So this really does highlight the importance of monetizing the other portion of your players who will never purchase anything in your game. Let's take a look at how ad revenue is split against in-app purchase revenue. So this chart shows the total advertising revenue when compared to the total in-app purchase revenue per genre. In the previous chart, we say that hyper-casual and word games have extremely low payer percentages, and that is reinforced here when you see that these games actually derive most of their revenues from in-app purchases or for in-app advertising. Conversely, when you take a look at the traditionally mid-core and hardcore genres like role-playing games or strategy games, much more of the revenues are tied and derived from in-app purchases. The data here shows that all genres of games should really seek to have a balanced mix of revenue streams that includes both in-app purchases and advertising. Let's take a look at advertising strategy in particular, as it's a revenue source that impacts the highest number of a game's active player base. So choosing how to implement ad placements in your game can come with a lot of unknowns. Answers to questions about what kind of ad mix to implement, ad formats, length, volume, and timing can really feel like secret knowledge that's only really known by top studios after years of trial and error. But we're here to hopefully help you guys make a little bit less of those errors and make more of the money instead. So let's first talk about the two main kinds of full screen ads that you see in mobile games. The first is known as the interstitial ad. These ads are usually skippable after around 5 to 10 seconds and will automatically appear at some break in the gameplay, such as a level complete or a certain number of actions taken. These ads generally find their home in more casual games. The second ad type are rewarded video ads. These ads only play when the player prompts them to, and usually reward the player with an in-game reward like gems, coins, a power-up, a booster of some kind. These ads have a wide application across all genres of games, but we generally recommend them for the mid-core and hardcore genres like RPG and strategy titles who want to engage with ads. These games have players who are really less tolerant of unprompted interstitial ads, but these players are happy to engage with rewarded video ads that reward them with some kind of progression in exchange for their time. On the topic of rewarded video, we dove deeper into the completion rate of players who watched rewarded video ads. Completion rate is the percentage of players who, once they initiate a rewarded video ad, finished watching the whole video and claimed a reward from the game. Overall, nearly 90% of users completed watching the ad to receive the reward. And this was fairly high across all genres and really showed that the rewarded video ad format is an engaging way to monetize users while still rewarding them for their time, but not asking them to spend money. Because as you know, the payer conversion rate is actually pretty low. So as I just said previously, nearly 90% of ad watchers will complete a rewarded video ad and then claim the reward. However, we did see that 10% of users will close the ad after watching around 75% of it, or 3/4 of it. And there are 11% of users who will watch the entire ad, but don't end up claiming the actual reward in the game. In this last case, they've likely already exited or closed the game, the last quartile of the ad. But why would this be the case? So the player might have installed the advertising app and navigated away from the main app. This is obviously a fear for many developers when utilizing ad monetization, as they're worried about users churning out from their titles. However, our data shows that due to downloading and installation times, the user actually usually returns to the game while they wait for the new app to download to claim their ad. And you can see that here, it's basically 90% of them do come back. In the cases that they don't, it usually means that the reward might not have been kind of compelling enough for them to return to the game after watching through the ad and kind of going through the App Store installation process. So it's really important to make sure that that reward is compelling for the user to come back to. So knowing when to surface your ads is also just as important as having them in the first place. There's not a player in the world who wants to open up a game and immediately be greeted with an unprompted interstitial ad. So on average for games, we actually see that the first interstitial ads are triggered after around at least 5 minutes of gameplay, and the first rewarded video ad opportunities are surfaced around the 5 to 6 minute mark. This timing varies among game genres. For example, hyper-casual titles will show the first ad almost 3 minutes earlier than a card game title. And once again, these benchmarks are by no means prescriptive to every game, but we feel that they are useful insights for developers seeking to compare their game's kind of user experience when it comes to ads to how other games have implemented their ad monetization strategy. So next, I'll hand it over to Kristen to take a look at some benchmarks from the year in mobile monetization.
Thank you, Emery. So in this last part, we do want to provide a quick review of in-app purchase and in-app advertising average revenue per daily active user trends seen across genres, because these metrics are often used as the North Star metric that game developers use to track game success. In terms of ad opt-out, except for hyper-casual, puzzle, and adventure games, other genres actually experience year-over-year increase. Board, trivia, card, and word games have been leading the race in their year-over-year ad opt-out growth. Overall, majority of the genres, except for board, trivia, strategy, role-playing, and arcade games, had year-over-year increase in both in-app advertising and purchase opt-out, suggesting that for the most part, game monetization was scaling at a healthy pace and they're not inexpensive each other. On the other hand, sports game, casual, racing, and casino games saw the most significant year-over-year percentage growth in IAP opt-out. Before we close, I'm going to pass the stage back to Emery for a recap of all the takeaways that we have gone through in this webinar.
Thanks, Kristen. So this brings us to the end of our talk today. To recap, there are 6 key insights we really recommend to anybody in the business of mobile games to remember. The first is to remember to identify a target audience for your game before or during the early creation process. This can save you a ton of headaches down the road as you try to find a good product market fit. The second is to choose the right time and places to soft launch your title, and invest in user acquisition during this period. We provided some rough benchmarks as well as duration for self launches of what to expect when you are going to hit peak DAU. Next, remember to pick the right combination of game genres to target so that you don't spend all of your ad budget on genres that might not convert nearly as well for your game. Early user acquisition spend is critical to inform your strategy as well as your overall scale that you can hope to hit with your game. Fourth, remember to fine-tune your ad creatives by optimizing the parts of the creative that maximize click-through rates and conversions. A/B testing what works for your particular game is highly recommended. Fifth, find the right balance between both advertising and in-app purchase revenues for your game. Different genres tend to have different balances, but even within each genre, every game is different. And lastly, remember to utilize industry trend reports from white papers and reports to benchmark your own game's growth, such as this one or some of the other ones that Unity has written. So thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to our webinar. We're going to open up the floor now to answer some of the questions that were asked. Okay, I do see actually just like one high level question of how do you make a mobile game with ads? We're always of the belief that if you are making a game, you should not only design the game to be a fun experience for players, but also take into account the monetization strategies you might employ. You might not want ads at all in your game, in which case you have to build your game's core loop and progression structures around purely in-app purchases and making sure that your players do end up converting to payers. However, if you're going to have a game that has ads in it, in addition to in-app purchases, you can start thinking about where those ads might be best surfaced. So for example, if you have a casual match-3 puzzle game, do you want an ad surfaced after every 2 or 3 levels that the player kind of completes, or do you want to just only have rewarded video ads for those players to watch to get boosters in there? These are all parts of the game's design that you should really consider during that time. Let's see, another question. Okay, so somebody asked, can you explain more about how you arrived at some of our conclusions? How are you able to say that X performed better than Y? So we took all of our data from Unity's platform. So, at Unity, we have, I believe the last number I checked was like over 60,000 developers using our products and over 300,000 different games. So, while we're unable to see the full scope of the industry, we have a pretty good representative sample. So what we actually did is that we looked at data coming from our Unity engine, our Unity ad network platform, as well as other things like Unity Analytics, all of our various live gaming services that we have with Unity Gaming Services, looked at all the data from that, anonymized that, and then basically we're able to do analysis on top of those. Now, of course, the data analysis that we're doing is based off of our own opinions and experience overall in the industry. But that's kind of how we arrived at the conclusions that we're talking about in this report in particular. Let's see. A couple other questions. Somebody in the chat asked, any idea how ad-driven monetization compares getting to something like Apple Arcade? So while I can't speak to the specifics of Apple Arcade's royalty and payment structure, ad-driven monetization is kind of a different view of how you want your game to engage with your players. If you are monetizing via ads, you scale up your revenues based on how many ads your user base watches every day, which means one of two things. Either A, you can get your existing users to watch a lot more ads each, but honestly, that's not a good player experience because if somebody's watching a bunch of ads while playing a game, they might end up leaving. Or the alternative is that you can get more players to watch the same number of ads, which will increase your total number. So when you compare that to something like Apple Arcade has a very confined user base of people who have chosen to subscribe to and play games on Apple Arcade. The user base there is much smaller, so the experiences are also tailored in a different way. So I would not just look at like, hey, how does this compare, but also look at your kind of game. If your kind of game is more about like, hey, I want to have like a massively multiplayer social kind of game, ad monetization is probably a better fit for you than something like Apple Arcade is. Let's see. I'm going through a lot of chat questions now. Somebody did ask about how we define soft launch. So soft launch is something that everybody kind of defines differently. For us in particular, we had a very specific definition that we took in this report. Essentially, it's primarily a strategy and user acquisition testing tactic where a developer releases a game ahead of its scheduled global launch, or even without a scheduled global launch date in mind, without a really full-scale global marketing push. So you basically will do user acquisition and target specific countries that Kristen kind of highlighted earlier in this report. And the reason why you do this is because user acquisition is expensive. It's a lot cheaper to acquire a user that isn't from a tier 1 country like the United States than it is to acquire a user somewhere else. And when you can scale up more cheaply, you can get a better idea of user behaviors in a game without having to basically pay a bunch of money to grab enough of a user base to get a representative sample. So that's why a lot of companies do soft launch. It also allows you to basically test it with a smaller audience, so you can kind of take pips and shivets with, shift a lot of your strategy and what you want to do in your gameplay or your overall monetization mechanics without having to affect a bunch of people all at once. They really let you kind of optimize your marketing spend by testing those strategies ahead of kind of the wider scale launch. Let's see.
So I think I can take one question about interstitial ad frequency during a play session. So as Emery has like touched base on when answering an earlier question, so like the last thing that people would want is probably spamming a user with back-to-back interstitial ads after several turns, or like just after after every single game. But what's important is that it's also to know that like the interstitial ad ECPM, which is like the revenue that you get paid per 1,000 ad impressions, actually declines if you schedule all of your ads to like back to back and close to each other on a user level. And that's because if you think about it, when user is seeing like maybe like the 4th or 5th ad, or even like the 10th ad down the line in the same session or in the same day, the chances of them converting on that ad is like basically like much lower, because they are like at that point they're already like fully like clean loaded, and they just don't want to see more ads, so they are not going to take action on your ads. So at that point, it's really important for you to like maybe consider, for example, do you want to show interstitial ad after only when a user win at a game, or like do you want to cap like the maximum interstitial ad that are being shown to user within a session? We've seen like people have successes in doing both, so capping, gating, and also like having cooldown between interstitial ad are all important strategies there.
So we have another question on, is monetizing a game as simple as using the Unity ads feature? So if your game is built in Unity, yes, you can enable Unity ads pretty much very quickly from within the engine. I wouldn't say it's just as simple as turning it on, because once again, you should kind of follow what we've kind of talked about in this presentation about thoughtfully placing where your ads should be surfaced, when they should be surfaced, as well as how they integrate with your game. Nothing takes a player out of a game experience more than just randomly getting an ad when it doesn't feel like it's a good point. Like, for example, once again, if I go back to the match 3 puzzle game example, if I'm trying to match, different gems and jewels together and an ad pops up in the middle of me matching, that's not a good time, right? You want to put it at the end or at the beginning level or in some natural breaking gameplay. But yes, it's fairly easy to activate Unity ads with making Unity games just from our editor directly. Let's see. So a lot of questions. So another question is, what would be the best strategy for soft launching a game that targets 3 different player personas speaking 3 different languages? But choosing one persona in one language in one country that might be easier to identify bugs and expand slowly to other countries that speak other languages. So it really depends on kind of your pipeline here. A lot of times when we get a question like this, I immediately think like, hey, you probably have either some kind of multiplayer game or a word game that's language specific. Really, if you are going to launch in, let's say, 3 different languages, and then one of these languages is going to be in a tier 1 geo like the UK or the US or Canada where they're English speaking, you should soft launch it in a place that is also English speaking, but a little bit cheaper. There are a lot of European countries that do speak, that have large English speaking user bases that you can kind of test on that's a little cheaper. In terms of bugs, that's really just on the game development side of things. Just make sure your localization pipeline is rather sturdy and localization QA is also very important in my experience for games like that. You want to make sure that you're investing in that and that you either hire the right people for that, or you have a pretty robust way of finding out bugs that might be in a language that you might not personally understand. Another question, any tips for monetization in a single player game versus multiplayer? So in a multiplayer game, I will say that one of the hard and fast rules I often will stick by is never introduce monetization in the middle of the kind of multiplayer game loop experience, because that is when players are interacting with each other, and that's when they really don't like the feeling of like, oh, I'm being taken out of this interaction with somebody else to watch an ad or to, be prompted for a purchase. For multiplayer games, if you are going to have ads in them, I would recommend they either be in between that multiplayer session. Like, for example, there are a lot of social word games that, after you've made a move in the asynchronous multiplayer, then you get an ad during that break time. That's kind of a good time to put interstitial, or with multiplayer games that you don't want interstitial ads in, if you're going to do rewarded video, I'd recommend, having those as almost power-ups that you watch from the in-game shop to, watch a power-up, watch an ad to get like a free chest or a crate or something like that, but not integrating that into your actual core game loop, because nobody wants to be waiting in a lobby for somebody to finish watching an ad because everybody else is waiting to play, right? You want to just make sure that experience is pretty smooth.
And to answer the question about like, is banner ads still worth it in this day and age? I think it, like again, it really depends on the genre of your game. Like, so for example, if your game is like an idle game, or like in other categories of like the hyper casual game, like banner ads like could still be worth it, especially like it depends on how you integrate banner ads, like in terms of placement. So for example, if you actually have like a persistent banner that refreshes, every 30 seconds, and it's like either on the bottom, on the top of the screen, and it appear like the impressions keep going when the users is playing the game, that could be a really good source of like kind of like ad impression that you continuously get. We've also seen like some like banner ads implementation that are more welcome by users, especially when we see games that would actually make it more like a user optional or player or like kind of give them more like authority in terms of how they want to see banner ads. So for example, you can turn on banner ads, and then that will allow them to get like a point multiplier, or like a a coin multiplier in the idle game. And those are pretty innovative and are welcomed by users. And of course, banner ads in and of itself is driven by impression, because like the revenue that you get per 1,000 impression is comparatively lower than interstitial ad or rewarded ad.
All right, I've now managed to scroll all the way up to the question, and I see one of the first questions here is, how has bidding impacted user acquisition and ad mod performance in the last 12 months? For those of you who are unfamiliar, bidding is basically a way to automate your ads waterfall. And I'm really going into technicals here, which is kind of beyond the scope of this, but just to answer the question directly. The ads waterfall in general is basically, you have a bunch of different participating networks and you're trying to get the highest price for every ad impression. Bidding automates that so you don't have to set up different line prices for everyone's ad networks. In the last 12 months, we've seen bidding become more and more widespread, because once again, it means less work for the game developer to manage their ad monetization stack, which means that they have more time to actually develop the game and develop those game mechanics. Now, in terms of ad monetization performance, the bigger impact has actually been quite a few of the privacy changes that we've seen in the industry, with Apple's iOS 14 and ATT prompts actually having a pretty heavy impact on a lot of other ad networks out there in terms of performance overall. So I would say the privacy kind of changes have been a lot more than bidding, so to say, because bidding's impact has really been on the back end of making things more easy. Because in the past, you could have big ad yield teams kind of managing your waterfall and get very similar performance to bidding. But what bidding does is kind of make that a little bit more widespread and makes it so that even smaller teams can have that same amount of optimization. But bidding has been around for 2 or 3 years at this point, whereas we really saw the impact from privacy actually very recently, because that's when everything started rolling out on that side. Okay. Some questions about how to drum up publicity for your game without feeling overbearing for your customers, or what the best way to promote or market your new game. We talked about user acquisition. User acquisition can take a lot of different forms, but The kind that is probably the most effective that we've seen here at Unity is you've got stuff like social media and content influencers and stuff, but the most direct way to measure things is performance advertising, which is obviously going to an ad network like Unity's and saying, hey, I've got a game that I want to promote and I want to market to a specific user sect. And then you can work with our teams to basically identify what games that you should be targeting. And with performance-based advertising, you set an amount that you want to pay per install of your game or impression that a user views. And then you can basically target that. And you basically only pay based off of that performance index. This is really useful because you can say, for example, I'm only willing to pay $2 per active user install of my game. But you know from your own data and from your own analytics that over time, a user's lifetime value in your game is, let's say, $3 or $4. This means that if you pay $2 per user and you're getting a lifetime value of 3 or 4, that's basically your profit margin in between the two of them. And you could probably even scale up your price point to $2.50, saying, hey, I'm only pay up to $2.50, but I'm still making $3 on that user kind of long term. Now, that's really kind of reductive overall of the overall process, but that's the easiest way to get performance directly out of it. Things like social media influencers, sponsorships, or kind of other kind of ad spots are all more holistic in terms of advertising, but you don't get the direct kind of pay for performance that you do with performance advertising that you get with a direct ad network. Somebody else asks, it's really important to know how to market in particular is choosing a particular kind of game to develop. Could I get this kind of information daily, in which page or platform? So we obviously have our subgenre daily active user breakdown that we covered earlier in this report. Publishing that daily would be quite a task for, I think, any team. So unfortunately, we can't update it that frequently. Honestly, we have yearly reports that go over this. And if you want to get a kind of a deeper pulse on things, there are a lot of other app insights platforms out there that you can use to get freshly scraped information, so to say, from the app stores, or just looking at the top charts, to be honest, just to kind of see what kind of games are trending. But for us, we will usually publish reports either quarterly or kind of once a year.
And in terms of is in-app purchases worth it in a casual or a pachinko type game, specifically, like the question was asking about, like for boosters and also for unique characters, like we definitely see that as an increasing trend in the past 2 years when we look within casual or even like hyper casual game. Because like ultimately, if we think about like in-app purchases, like the users who would be willing to like spend actual money in the game are usually like the more loyal user base, and they are like actually hooked like in the game. So like if we think about it, then they are also like more in like more willing to customize their game into something that they feel like is their own. And if you give them like more levers to kind of change up, like not even just the character, but also maybe the skin of the game, that would also be intriguing for them. And also like other like types of cosmetic rewards are also often used as an in-app purchase item in casual and also pachinko like games.
So somebody also asked, and this is a much more specific question, so apologies if it doesn't kind of ring true with everybody, but specifically any insights as to why industry reports are showing Android CPI continue to increase. So CPI is a cost per install on Android, whereas the CPM of basically the cost per impression is seeing a decline in 2022. So when you have an install price increasing while the actual individual impression decreases, that usually means that conversion is getting worse. And what we've seen overall in the industry is essentially conversion gets worse because of increased privacy regulations. Even though iOS is the only one doing it right now and Android hasn't kind of enacted those yet, the overall social graph that a lot of ad networks use is on both sides of that house. So you're going to see kind of one on each. Let's see. Are there any comparisons between specific type of ad displays like in-game 3D ads versus on-top windows and so on? I'm assuming by on-top windows, you're talking about banner and in-game 3D ads. Maybe you're talking about like kind of the 3D billboard ads that you might see in the game. We don't have data on the kind of the 3D billboard ad kind of structure just because we That's not an official ad format that we support, but also I have seen it in games, and that's much more of a custom kind of per game level. So we don't have like wide anonymized network level data for that. As for banner ads, as Kristen touched on earlier, banner ads are still worth doing. They definitely have much lower CPMs than the full screen because they are just kind of there rather than taking the full user's attention. But once again, it really depends on your game's play experience. Often it can be said that if your game has banner ads, it feels a little bit less premium because there's always an advertisement on the screen rather than the game taking up the full experience. But that can be fine for certain kinds of apps. So it's really kind of dependent on what you want your user experience to be like, balanced against your own responsibilities to want to make money to help support your studio and your livelihood. I believe we're getting close to the end of time, so I might just go ahead and start closing up here. So I want to thank everybody again for taking the time to listen to our webinar. If you've enjoyed the presentation or found it insightful, we've got a lot of other reports and white papers available at the Unity Insights webpage. You can also contact our team at the address shown here. And in particular, if you're interested in working with the publisher operations team in particular, let support teams know and they'll reach directly to us if there's something that you really want to kind of do more research into. If you have a very specific question, or if you have a game that you want us to kind of sit down and really deconstruct and inspect and kind of help to optimize, there are services that we offer to help you do that. But overall, there's a lot of information that's available online, and we hope that you guys learned something today. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And yeah, have a great rest of your week.